Throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box and we'll do our best to respond throughout the webinar or either for the reserved Q&A session at the end. Questions not addressed in the webinar will be answered in a follow-up email. Now I'd like to tell you a little about InCycle. We help you deliver the best software to meet your goals with hundreds of successful deployments of Microsoft Visual Studio ALM and Team Foundation Server TFS. InCycle provides training process and tooling expertise to development teams that value high performance and a fully integrated ALM platform. As a Microsoft Gold ALM and Microsoft Azure partner, InCycle is uniquely positioned to help customers implement continuous delivery, DevOps strategies, and the Microsoft Cloud to maximize value and reduce costs. Over the next 45 minutes, Gregory will be presenting compelling statistics about cloud computing and why our organization should be moving to the cloud, specifically Windows Azure, and the typical first step is migrating an application to Azure. At this time, I'd like to introduce our presenter, Gregory Shepard. Gregory brings real-world experience with both Azure and mobile development. Gregory is a significant contributor to Microsoft Azure. He has worked with web and worker roles as well as Azure SDK. On the mobile side, he enjoys working with mobile technologies, including Xamarin. Now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Gregory Shepard. Over to you, Gregory.
Thanks a lot, Stephanie, and good afternoon to everyone, and thanks for joining us in this webinar. Hope you'll get some good value and learn a good amount about Azure and moving your business to Azure. So for today, our agenda is going to be, one, should you consider Azure? Two, we're going to introduce you through some statistics and tell you a little bit about what it is and how it works. We'll present you with a planning framework that we use, particularly one that's streamlined for migrating applications to Azure. We'll give you an example of a migration in action, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. So the first question is, should you consider Azure? And we hope that after this webinar, and hopefully you'll have a good answer. And effectively, the good hint here is the answer is yes. Cloud computing. The National Institute of Standards in the U.S. defines 5 key characteristics for cloud computing. One is that it's an on-demand service, that it's available through the internet, so this broad network access, that resources are pooled or shared, and that's a key concept in the sense that when you look at solutions, in some cases, sharing resources may not be applicable. So resource sharing and pooling is a key characteristic of cloud computing. Rapid elasticity, which means that you can increase the amount and scalability of resources as demand increases, and at the same time you can reduce the number of resources if demand decreases. And the final is that it's a measured service. Effectively, you should be able to pay for only what you use. So there are some key trends in cloud computing. Number one is it's growing like crazy. If you look at this particular graph and the blue line in particular, it looks like what you might consider to be the typical growth path for technology, which is that early on there are a few innovators, things start picking up with early adopters, and you get to the phase where we are today where what we call early majority, there are a bunch of folks considering and moving to the cloud. Obviously, it's a curve in that as we move forward, there are fewer folks joining the cloud computing revolution, and then there's those at the very end, tail end, who wait maybe until it's too late for their business to move to the cloud. So some of the accelerators in in the cloud trend today are business agility, and that is companies are interested in trying to do more with less. And I think we've all heard about that in lots of different ways. We're seeing social media and consumers and effectively social media consumers are consumers are using social media in a sense that there are lots of consumers. I mean, Facebook has a billion users. I mean, it's just unprecedented. So how do you manage a billion users? And device proliferation, the mobile platform has grown dramatically. Most everybody has a mobile device. So if you look at mobile devices and computers and desktop and the like, that the number of devices is growing rapidly. So the cloud is for handling, number of devices and the various platforms that are available. And the other is what they call big data. You've probably heard this term big data or seen it in television ads. And I could say it simply, big data is big data, that there's a lot of data that comes from these devices, and people in company organizations are trying to figure out how to take that data and make sense of it. These are the primary accelerators for cloud computing, and to some degree, you have to look at where your organization, and particularly if you're trying to enable technology as a strategic driver for your business, being in at the early majority stage makes a lot of sense. Some additional statistics. 50% of the Fortune 500 are using Windows Azure specifically as a cloud service. More than a million SQL databases in Azure. 1.6 million registered developers or organizations with Visual Studio Online, which is a software as a service offering from Microsoft. 13 billion authentications per week. I mean, the numbers are astounding, and I think these numbers story and one is that the value proposition is real for large and small organizations, like with increasing numbers of developers working in the cloud. And this is sort of an indirect, is that the cloud is delivering on trust via redundancy and disaster recovery strategies that are easy to manage, affordable, and robust. And one analogy that I like to use is that if you look at safety as an issue, effectively every car has an airbag today, and so safety is ubiquitous. And the cloud must deliver on trust, and that trust is coming through these kinds of redundant services and disaster recovery, the things that typically are really hard for companies to implement. And they give them that assurance that that the cloud will deliver, and that if there's a hiccup, that they have an alternative to keep going. So these, I think, some compelling statistics and trends that pretty much say, a lot of folks are doing this. They're finding value, and for you, if you're considering that move today, probably is a good day to consider starting and towards the cloud, and particularly to Windows Azure. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about Microsoft Azure. Give you an introduction. The first thing is to understand that there are three service types. So we hear about, cloud services, and unfortunately, I think sometimes that word service gets added in there, because when we break down cloud computing, we offer services. So the first is software as a service, and a really good example of software as a service is Microsoft Office 365, which provides you with email, SharePoint, and other services delivered as a cloud service. It's subscription-based. It's really easy to use. There's no IT management by you. Effectively, all you have to do is sign up, and you can use it. So software as a service is a basic cloud offering. It's one where It's really easy to onboard and to begin using. Platform as a service is a little more complex, but still very easy in the sense that it provides building block resources for developers to build solutions. So one of the ways that it makes things easy is that it's the operating system, storage, compute, all the hardware, software kinds of things that you normally would run, as a simple analogy on your desktop are now in the cloud. And effectively what your job is then is to move applications and to manage specifically your application on that platform. So effectively there's no IT management by users there as well. And that's one of the compelling value propositions of platform as a service. Infrastructure as a service is the platform that provides you with the greatest degree of control, and effectively it's a virtualized server and network components encapsulated together to make it easy for you to provision servers and resources as required, effectively being able to duplicate what might be currently in your data center if you manage one, or in some hosted environment if someone else is managing it for you. But it does give you control of all the components. There is IT management, quote unquote, required, but you'll be able to leverage some other high-level objectives like cost savings, reduce management loads, the ability to use the latest hardware and software in a virtualized environment, which doesn't require to actually manage real hardware. So infrastructure as a service, again, provides you the greatest degree of control. Platform as a service gives you a little less control, but still is very easy to use. And software as a service is obviously the very simplest approach, where we basically subscribe to something like an Office 365. Another way of looking at infrastructure as a service and platform as a service in a comparison is one in a couple of different metrics here, but management. If we're looking at infrastructure as a service, I mentioned that there's more IT management. So you will be responsible for managing applications, data, the runtime, any middleware, and the operating system. You won't be responsible, obviously, for managing hardware. It does provide you with a great degree of control. It gives you the maximum support for legacy applications. So most organizations have applications that are already in production, and they want to continue supporting them. So infrastructure as a service gives you the maximum flexibility to support those legacy applications if you move them to the cloud. Agility, which is the we'll call the ease of moving forward with an initiative, is lower vis-a-vis platform as a service, only because you do have more of a management responsibility. And ease of use is, I wouldn't call it low, but it effectively requires the skills of IT management. Platform as a service, in comparison, requires you to manage your applications and your data. And it provides you with a fairly high degree of control. You can support some legacy applications. So when considering legacy application migration to a platform as a service, there are some things that you have to ensure will map from your legacy application to, say, an Azure architecture. You do get greater agility, which means that you should be able to move forward or make changes or have innovative initiatives in platform as a service a little bit faster than you can with infrastructure. And it's relatively easy to use, again, because we're really just managing applications and data. In the Azure environment, there are two versions of platform as a service. One is what we call a web worker role, which is effectively, if you've worked with websites, it's what we consider a web application, which is slightly more complex than a website, in that there are more features that you can control. And then websites, which are the most common denominator for most of us when we consider the intranet, and whether that's a static corporate website or a business website, or one that actually has some dynamic data. The Azure environment makes it very easy to manage websites, and specifically developed an offering around that, because there are so many websites, and making it easy for users is a value offering that makes a lot of sense. So again, when we look at support for legacy applications, the support is a little lower. Agility is very high because it's relatively straightforward to move websites to the Azure platform, and ease of use is very high as well. So if we look at these two approaches, infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, I think we can begin to delineate where the two separate, and to some degree, why one is more valuable than another. The Azure environment is more than just virtual machines out somewhere on the internet. It's a very wide offering by Microsoft, and in fact, it's very impressive in the number of features that they've made available today. In what we call the compute environment, that's virtual machines. We talked a little bit about websites and web applications, and generally what we call cloud services. As we look at managing data, it's SQL databases. You can manage Oracle databases, NoSQL databases like Mongo. There's an offering called the storage services, which includes blobs, which is large binary objects. Those kinds of things can be files. They can be like PDFs. They can be images. They could be media assets. Effectively, you can manage nearly any kind of object in the storage blob, and it's relatively inexpensive. It becomes a very good platform to manage assets for websites or for staging, as an example. Storage tables represents what's considered NoSQL, which is an alternative, a very fast alternative to traditional relational databases. There's also an offering called storage queues, which I'll get to in a second, which offers a disconnected messaging framework to allow applications to communicate asynchronously, which allows them to do what they do best and move relatively quickly, which allows applications to scale in the cloud well. And then there's import, which allows you to move large data sets to the Azure platform. And then from the networking perspective, when you move to the cloud, you're effectively creating what we'll call a cloud service, and all the resources that are networkable are connected to a virtual network in the cloud. You can manage that network. You can connect that network to your on-premise environment. You can make very secure connections with what's called ExpressRoute, and you can manage traffic to your virtual network and to resources that you've provisioned in Azure by using Traffic Manager, which effectively can move traffic in a round-robin fashion from server A to server B, or gives you, say, the flexibility to do what you call A/B testing, where you have website, your current website, and your upcoming changes, and you want to move a percentage of traffic to the B site so that you can measure user acceptance. So Traffic Manager gives you flexibility of doing those kinds of things. And then developer services, and tools, Visual Studio Online, which allows you to manage your source control and provides management constructs to manage your teams and tasks as they develop software. There's the Azure Software Development Kit that allows you to more specifically integrate Azure resources into applications. Azure tools for Visual Studio. So Visual Studio as a integrated development environment is very well integrated into Azure. And there are automation tools that allow you to schedule tasks, backup data, and do a variety of things that will lessen your management load. Again, the Azure framework is a platform is very broad, but I just want to mention quickly that because we will be talking a little bit about the service bus and service bus queues and blob service when we talk about our migration application. And so again, I just wanted to mention that a queue is effectively a messaging framework that allows an asynchronous communication between various parts of an application or various components of an application, and allows applications to scale because that they are disconnected and not really dependent upon one another. But as we look again at the offering, we see Active Directory available in Azure, multi-factor authentication, which probably people are seeing more and more of today. When you change your password as well, you may get a text message and an email message to validate that you're doing the right thing. That service is made available through Azure, and it's relatively easy to use. Mobile services have been targeted specifically in what we call a mobile-first approach. As we see the proliferation of mobile applications, the Azure environment provides tools like notification hubs to be able to scale millions of notifications to a broad variety of platforms: Windows Mobile, iOS, and Android applications, all at the same time and relatively within a really short time. So you can send 1 million notifications in under a minute. Backup and recovery are huge. I mentioned backup and recovery being key tools for building trust, and the offering in Azure is very broad, robust, and reliable. We look at performance, where we can move in cache, which is the framework that will allow you to move assets around the world in the various data centers that are run by Microsoft to get content, static content, closer to where users are, so that you're not sending a file from, say, New York to Moscow, but maybe from somewhere in the Ukraine to Moscow, because there's a data center there. And media services, as an example, managing, encoding, and delivering or streaming media content to users and integrating into applications is another great Azure offering. So we'll chat a little bit about the bigger issue today, which is what we'll call a typical on-ramp for organizations considering the cloud, which is, okay, let's start relatively small and let's consider migrating one of our existing applications to the Azure framework, and let's see how it works. So we're going to present a relatively straightforward framework and take you through some of the key issues and then present an example. So our high-level planning framework is relatively straightforward: prepare, migrate, and measure. And as we know, that success is typically predicated upon very good or excellent preparation. So our prepare step is very important. It becomes the foundation for this planning framework. In this particular case, we're going to be talking about migration of an application. So our second step there is migrate, and measure is important because typically when we do one thing, we always think about reproducing that process, using that content, somehow taking advantage of the work that we've done to do it over again. So measuring becomes important, and establishing measures so that you can iterate and do what you've done once again and do it better requires a sense of establishing some measures and taking that feedback into consideration as you consider doing the same thing again. So let's talk a little bit about the preparation step. One of the most important things to consider, and I believe to take advantage of, is that when you're considering on one hand, it looks relatively straightforward. On the other hand, there are lots of pieces. It's really important to your development team to the Azure framework and what you can do, what you can't do, or what things might require a change in architecture or approach. I also believe it's really important to establish a high-level strategy, talking about our goals and objectives, to identify key objectives for using Azure. Just some examples off the top, or security or scalability. If you have an application that's running in production somewhere today, and you're finding that you're continually adding new resources to your on-premise or other network or infrastructure to deal with the growth in users or with peak demand, scalability may be a very good key consideration for you. Ease of maintenance is always something that everyone's looking for. How do I do more with less? And also looking at risks. How do I back up my data? How do I deal with a disruption in my network or my infrastructure, or the infrastructure that someone else is running that may not be as robust as Azure? So these become key objectives for you to consider as you're moving to Azure, and taking a look at those things, I think, is really important up front. I talked a little bit about measures that we'll use as we iterate through doing things and trying to do them better. So understanding how you look at those key measures is important, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. And then in a migration initiative, it's important to consider what applications make sense to migrate to the Azure cloud. Some are better candidates than others, and specifically as we look at those candidate applications vis-a-vis our objectives, we begin to narrow the list of candidates. And effectively, after we've gone through a process of listing our candidate applications and discussing it within your organization, ultimately you're going to select one or a few applications. And obviously, if this is the first time, you'll select one as a proof of concept, or as a way to get into the Azure cloud for the first time. Also in preparation, Preparation is really about planning. Now, those things that we just talked about in the last slide obviously are part of the plan, but we will have detailed plans specifically as we look at our existing application and what it means to map that application into the Azure framework. So there are a couple of key considerations. There are network upgrades potentially or changes. There's security to consider if you have on-premise Active Directory, or if you're just using a relatively straightforward username password authentication for your, say, a web application. You might consider using Azure Active Directory in the cloud. If you do have an on-premise Active Directory, there are some considerations for either synchronizing an Azure Active Directory with your on-premise or using standalone Azure Active Directory. And those considerations, again, will come about through either security policies that have been established in your organization or other considerations that you may have as you look at moving this application to the cloud. There's likely to be some application refactoring with Visual Studio and the Azure Software Development Kit. I think you'll find that you can actually add, you can easily move an application to the cloud because the SDK actually builds on top of the ASP.NET framework from Visual Studio's perspective. So there may not be a lot of refactoring required, but you will find, for example, and we'll detail this in our example, that the version of SQL Server that runs in Azure as a service, not a SQL Server virtual machine, but the Azure SQL Server version is slightly different, and there are some features that are not fully supported. So you may consider or have some considerations around how your database is working if you're using SQL Server. I mentioned a messaging framework called in Azure Storage called Queues, which becomes a great tool for disconnecting components of your application and allow it to perform better and scale better. It's very likely that if you're considering using that kind of a framework, that there's going to be some application refactoring required. So you're also going to want to consider performance and scaling. Azure provides you with a number of what we'll call automated scaling features based upon, say, CPU usage, or by a demand schedule. If you know, for example, you have a web application or a website that has great demand on Mondays and Tuesdays, between the hours of during the lunch hours, it's very possible that you could consider a performance scaling measures for that time period, and that kind of flexibility is available. And then you're obviously, if you have a web application or a website that leverages data, SQL Server as an example, you're going to need to migrate that data as well to the Azure platform, and you're going to need a plan for that. So these are effectively the key items that you'll need to detail in order to make sure that you cover your bases in moving that application into Azure. And then after you're done those things and everybody's comfortable that you're ready to go, you most likely would then go to Azure, and assuming that you've already established a subscription, there's some basic setup that you might perform, creating a storage account, creating your SQL Azure SQL Server version or instance, perhaps setting up caching. In this particular case, we are going to be setting up storage using Azure Queues and also the blob storage. So after we're done preparing and we've done our plans and we're ready to go, we're actually going to do the work of migration. And in this particular case, I grayed out some features of this process pipeline, and that's analysis, optimization, testing, and operation and management. Only because we're here today, we're more specifically focusing on the application migration and the data migration. And in that regard, we are going to actually make the changes that we planned for in the previous step, and we're going to convert this particular application to a Windows Azure role in this particular case, which is going to be what we call a web role. It's just basically a web application. We do, in this case, have some non-relational data, so we are going to move some non-relational data to Windows Azure, and we are going to also move relational data because we have a SQL database. And so these are the two things where we actually have to do the work of migration, so to speak. And in general, when we're looking at the measure step, I've got a couple of key points. One is you want to define some definition or create some metric so that you can define success. And it's basically going to be based upon some established measures that you have. And I'll give you an example as we look at our real live case here. In the end, you're going to want to document and present your findings. In many cases, you may be the evangelist in your organization for a move to the cloud, specifically to Windows Azure, and you may need to prove in the organization that this process and this plan and overall the end result was valuable to the organization. So you're going to want to document and present your findings. And then update your Azure strategy, or effectively your goals and objectives. In the end, you're going to plan the next migration because we believe and we know that you can be successful, and that there are those like InCycle that can help you ensure success. So we're going to talk specifically about an example today, and just as background, the application that we're going to talk about is a web application, much like Craigslist, that allows you to sign up users who want to post ads for other people to respond to, whether they're selling things or trying to meet people or whatever. So going back to our framework and looking at this particular application in a fictional company, the organization sat down and our development team was a little unsure about how to proceed, and from InCycle's perspective, it's very important to introduce the organization to Azure. So in this particular case, the team opted for a 5-day proof of concept engagement, bringing an organization in from the outside to take them through a proof of concept of moving an application, migrating an application to Azure. It becomes a sort of a hands-on learning experience to learn the concepts and the tools required to be successful in a migration. So learning, obviously, for the team is very key. The strategies and objectives for this particular case were, one, to lower the cost of deployments, and that's effectively dollars and cents, but indirectly measured by the amount of time that it takes to use the latest hardware and software. There's always a challenge of staying up with the latest hardware and software, and moving away from an on-premise environment to an Azure environment gives us the opportunity to get to the latest hardware and software, because that's the job that Microsoft does in terms of maintaining that hardware and software. We also determined that reducing IT management load was key, in the sense that sometimes the IT department finds that development is what we might call needy, because they're always trying to develop or create a new test server, and IT obviously has an ongoing workload. So one additional requirement to do something new sometimes presents a challenge, particularly when teams are always fighting to keep a full team together because of attrition, as an example. So reducing that management workload is key as an objective here. There is also a desire to consider what development and test would look like in the cloud, and strategically, if that is an objective for the organization, a simple on-ramp like migrating an application becomes a good way to begin to get your feet wet with the entire process of managing applications, migrating applications, developing and testing in the cloud. And the final objective was to be able to scale the application to hundreds of thousands of users, because in this case for this ad website is growing. So when we look at measures, the two key measures here are time feature updates or deployments. This, we talked a little bit about agility. This is sort of a measure of agility indirectly, and also a sort of an indirect measure of cost, because the longer it takes to do it, obviously it takes time away from people, say, developing, or for the configuration management team or for the IT team to participate. And then also, in the end, if we can reduce the IT management load, then we've also sort of met some of our overall goals and objectives. So those are our measures, and we'll look and see if when we're done, if we've achieved some success there. And then finally, we selected an application. I did mention that it is an ad listing web application, and among the various candidate applications, this one seemed to be the most important, because in this case, this fictional company is in the business of serving up ads. So when we look at the migration step in detail, specifically from an existing application to moving to the Azure cloud, there are some things that there's some work that we're going to do. I mentioned that the migration step is sort of a work step, and that we're going to create an Azure cloud service. We're going to create an Azure SQL database, because we know we're going to migrate our data. We're going to create an Azure storage account, because that's where we're going to be able to leverage the disconnected Azure queues, and also a place where we're going to be able to store our large binary objects. In this case, they'll be images. We're going to configure this, our existing web application to use the Azure SQL database, and we're also going to configure the solution to use the Azure Blob and Queue that I just mentioned. And ultimately, we're going to, once we have all those things together and we've tested the application, we're going to deploy the project to the Azure Cloud Service. So just as an overview here, looking at the current architecture as a .NET application with key components as a SQL database, local file storage, and a Windows app that runs as a service that effectively takes the uploaded images and turns them into thumbnails that are then referenced back by the web application. It's fairly straightforward. This particular application runs in an on-premise data center, not that big, but it is in what we'll call an on-premise data center, and we're moving this application to Azure. So when we look I guess what we'll call the mapping step, all those plans that ultimately were put on paper, implemented that web site turns into a web role, or it maps into a web role in the Azure environment. That is going to be a database, a SQL database in Azure. That's pretty much the same. We noticed that there is a little bit difference in the middle, that the Azure blob sort of takes the place of the local file management, or local file server, if you will. And we see over there on the right side the Azure queue that represents sort of that messaging framework. And then the Windows service is mapped to a worker role. And so these two roles, a web role, I think you can pretty much get a good idea of what that is. It's pretty much that website that, or web application that is going to be running on the machine, and the worker role effectively is like a service. It's effectively asynchronous application, no different than a Windows service effectively. Now the key difference here is, there's the piece in the middle, Azure Blobs and Azure Queue, and these are two features that are available in Azure, and what they're going to allow us to do are to duplicate that file, or let's say to duplicate the functionality of a file service, but in a relatively more scalable and less expensive approach. And then the Azure Queue, which is interesting, becomes a mechanism to notify the worker role, which is going to look into the queue and say, hey, is there some work to be done? So when a user, in this particular case, uploads an image, a message gets sent to the Azure queue, and the worker role is always looking for messages. It finds that there's a message, and it says, hey, go, get that image, convert it to a thumbnail, and it goes through a process of converting it to a thumbnail, creating a URL, adding that URL to the SQL database, and that process works like the old process did, but it's now scalable in the sense that it's because it's disconnected, and it's because it's using the Azure Blob, which is a very fast service, if you will, and the Azure Queue, which is disconnected. We can now scale this application up to hundreds of thousands of users without seeing any real degradation in service or usability for the end user. So that sort of gives you a big picture of how this whole thing, in this particular case, would work. And then we talked a little bit about measuring and measurement being important. In this particular case, we wanted to look at the time for feature updates and deployment. As an example, we can stage updates to Azure from our Visual Studio tools in under 5 minutes. We're now ready to begin to leverage, say, using DevOps in the cloud. So using sort of the entire framework of application lifecycle management as and developer task and feature management in the cloud, because we now understand the cloud a little bit better. And we've reduced our IT management load because the IT team is primarily now monitoring alerts from Azure for things that might go wrong. So it's really more exception management, if you will. And they're not really required in this case to manage any hardware, software, or patches for any hardware. So the measurements effectively, or the perspective of the success of our measurements is updated. Our strategy is updated, and then we use these as a part of our presentation to management, particularly, say, in this case, to a CTO, to demonstrate that not only was our migration successful, but that we achieved scale and reduced costs and management workload, which makes a good case for planning the next migration. And in this fictitious company, we're going to migrate our vendor management portal. So I think this gives you a good some sense of, prepare, migrate, measure as it relates specifically to migrating an application, which may very well be the likely first step that you take as you move forward into the Azure cloud. And at this time, we can take some questions.
Thank you, Gregory. That was outstanding and very insightful. While you are thinking about the questions, I wanted to mention a few offers. The first one is Azure subscriptions. All developers who have Visual Studio with MSDN get a number of free subscriptions, such as Azure, Office 365 Developer, and a Windows Developer account. This subscription is the best way to get exactly what you need for your next project. Whether it's software, services, training, or support, you get the complete package for all your development and testing needs. And did you know that VSO is free for under 5 users? Be sure to get started today if you're not already using this tool. And the last program I wanted to mention is Microsoft's Architectural Design Services, or ADS. Microsoft Azure provides a great opportunity if you or your company are considering Azure. Microsoft is offering up to 5 days professional consulting to help you with your migration to Azure. So at this time, if you have any questions, we have about 5 minutes, so please type them in the chat box and I'll read them for Gregory to answer. Are there any questions? I'll wait about 1 more minute to see if there are any questions coming through. Okay, well, if you do have any questions, you can see Gregory's email on the screen. So that's all the time we have today. And thank you, Gregory, and thank you to the great folks at Microsoft for supporting this webinar. As we conclude, please follow us on Twitter at InCycle Software or on LinkedIn for more upcoming events. Thank you, and we hope to see you again soon.